Neo-Confucianism was a way of learning, a philosophy of learning, if you will, and a philosophy of the self, and a philosophy of the natural world. But it was also in some sense, we could refer to it as a set of ideas, a position that somebody could take, but it could also be an identity. That is, for people who decided to pursue this seriously, could begin to see themselves as people who had taken on a new set of ideas and a new set of practices. And when those people joined together, it could become a social movement. And in large part, thanks to Zhu Xi, Neo-Confucianism becomes a social movement in the 12th century of people who have made this their identity as scholars, as literati. It is very much a literati movement, and that's important to keep in mind. It involves a social program. It creates institutions, or it adopts institutional forms and promotes them that it believes, or that Neo-Confucians believe, will help both promote Neo-Confucianism and give people who become, who in some sense convert to the Neo-Confucian position, a chance to work together, to meet together, but also to do good for others. So we see the rise of the private academy. In the northern Song, in the 11th century, schools were almost entirely state schools. In the southern Song, in the 12th, 13th century, we see the appearance of private academies, privately funded schools that prepare people for learning and for the examinations. Neo-Confucians adopt the idea of private academies, but not so much for examination learning, but to promote their way of learning, to do what they call 讲学, discoursing on learning, where teachers and students talk together about Neo-Confucian ideas, Neo-Confucian interpretations of the classics, Neo-Confucian views of history, Neo-Confucian views of family rituals, Neo-Confucian views of how the community, the local community, should guide itself. They start to build shrines to Neo-Confucian masters. Out in the world, the Buddhists have shrines, the Taoists have shrines, there's shrines to local gods. Neo-Confucians build shrines to earlier Neo-Confucians and offer them sacrifices and worship them in some sense. They create community covenants where fellow people who share the faith, people who call themselves sometimes tongzhi, people of a common will, can make agreements to monitor each other and their behavior, to try to bring about a moral society through their own actions. And interestingly, these community covenants cross family boundaries. They include people from different families, breaking away from the notion that the relationship is between government and family. They now have interposed another level, community. Community guided by local people. They encourage the building of charitable granaries, where local wealthy people will, in fact, put in money to create relief granaries so farmers don't have to go to the government to borrow money and to borrow grain in spring for spring planting. They set up new rituals for the family. In all of these ways, Neo-Confucians are positioning their institutions between, on one hand, government institutions and government rules, and on the other hand, local religious rules, particularly Buddhist ones, because Buddhists, after all, also had institutions and schools and community covenants and community associations and charitable practices. Neo-Confucianism is also an intellectual movement with an intellectual program. It offers a new vocabulary. We've been talking about the word li, principle, but they start to have various definitions of philosophical terms which remain fairly constant, which they understand what they mean, that they introduce the notion of a philosophical vocabulary, a shared philosophical vocabulary, and books get written showing what these terms mean and citing various texts. They have shared ways of teaching. I've talked about discoursing on learning, the back and forth between teacher and student, often recorded in records of conversation, sometimes in the vernacular, in fact. They have sets of texts that they particularly favor and that they compile. So we have a great collection of teachings by Neo-Confucian masters, which is put together in the 12th century by Zhu Xi and one of his colleagues, Lu Zuqian, called Reflections on Things at Hand, or in Chinese, Jinsi Lu, right? Which is in fact a collection mainly of the oral teachings of Chang'e divided up into categories, new categories. And above all, they defined the goal of learning as sagehood, being a sage oneself. One result of Neo-Confucian teaching is a redefinition of the significance of the classics. Up until this point, the classics, by and large, referred to what are called the five classics, the texts of antiquity. Neo-Confucians create a set of texts that come to be known as the four books. They take two chapters out of one of the classics, called the Li Ji, the Record of Rites, a chapter called the Great Learning, the Da Xue, and a chapter called the Doctrine of the Mean, usually, Zhong Yong. And they say these books, together with the Mencius and the Analects of Confucius, constitute the four books. And the way you should study them is you begin with the Great Learning and you end with the Doctrine of the Mean. What makes these four books so special? Why are they so crucial? More important than the five classics, in fact. It's because they talk about the individual and individual life, the way in which an individual acts in the world rather than the state.